Cora Merrick carried every drop of water on that 80 acres herself. 2 years a widow outside Broken Bow, and she hauled it by the yoke, sun up to dark, across ground that drank faster than she could pour. Her palms cracked open in the July of it. They scabbed and cracked again. And not once, not to a neighbor, not to God, not to the empty side of the bed, did she ever say it was too much. Then came the September sale barn. A broken Aermotor windmill ran through the ring as junk iron, vane split, tail gone. Water, the one thing that would save her crop and the note against her land. And the landman, Harlan Pruitt, laughed to the whole floor. No water, no crop, no reason to keep the place. 40 men watching. And all Cora Merrick owned to her name that day was 1 bushel of navy beans. $1.60. So she turned, not to the auctioneer. She turned to the silent man standing at her shoulder. And she asked him something so small, it shames me to tell it. He said nothing back. And I'm going to cut away right there, before he answers. If you believe love is built with 2 pairs of hands, this story is for you. Before we go on, subscribe and comment what town you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Now, back to the beginning. Emil Merrick had picked that 80 acres himself. Picked it for the rise of it, the way you could stand at the north fence and see weather coming an hour off. He'd meant to sink a good well. He'd meant a lot of things. Then a horse went sideways in a wet spring and a wagon tongue caught him wrong, and Cora buried him under the one cottonwood that would grow, and the meaning to went in the ground with him. What was left was a hand pump that gave a thin cold trickle when it gave anything. A cistern with a crack you could lay 2 fingers in. And the yoke. She knew that yoke better than she'd known her husband's face by the end. Ashwood, worn pale where her neck rode it. 2 galvanized pails that clanged when they were empty and went silent and murderous when they were full. From the pump to the garden was 40 steps. From the pump to the hog lot was 60. From the pump to the young corn, when there was young corn, was a walk she counted in breaths so she wouldn't count it in anything worse. She rose in the dark. She hauled before the heat. She hauled again at dusk when the heat let go. Her shoulders built a ridge of muscle a farmhand would have been proud of, and her hands went to leather, and she told herself a body could get used to anything. And a body can. That's the terrible part. A body will get used to nearly anything you ask of it, long past the point your heart's begging you to stop. She owed $312. The note sat with the Custer County Farmers and Merchants Trust, with a clerk named Elgin, who was not a cruel man, only a careful one. $312, due the 1st of April, 1922. Without a crop, there was no paying it. Without water, there was no crop. And the arithmetic of that ran in a closed circle she'd traced 10,000 times over the yoke, until it wore a groove in her the same as the ashwood wore one in her shoulder. So she got by the only way she knew. She traded. Eggs, when the hens obliged. Mending, because her needle was quick and honest. She'd carry a dozen brown eggs to the Soward's place and come back with a sack of cornmeal, and here is the thing about Cora Merrick you have to understand, because the whole story turns on it. She never named a full price. Never once. She'd stand at Nella Soward's table with eggs worth 20 cents and say, "Would a nickel of meal be fair?" She asked for less than she needed every single time. As if wanting the right amount were a kind of greed. As if the safest thing a woman could do in this world was make herself small at the exact moment she wanted something most. Nella saw it. Nella always saw it. One evening in August, folding wash on the line between them, she got to teasing to lighten things. "You know what you were, Cora Voss, back before Emil?" She used the maiden name on purpose, the way old friends do. "You were the finest dancer that old Grange Hall ever put a floor down for. Feet like water. The boys used to fight over your card." Cora laughed and waved it off and pinned another shirt. "That girl's a long time gone." And that was all. It went by like a bird crossing a window. Neither of them held it. But hold on to it anyway, you and I. Set it up on a high shelf in the back of your mind. Cora Voss. The best dancer at the Grange, 1913. We are going to come back for it, and when we do, it is going to cost somebody 8 years of silence to hand it down. Now, the sale barn, Broken Bow, a Saturday in September, and the whole county funneled through the sale barn doors. Cattle and hogs and drought-broke men selling off what they couldn't feed through winter. The air was chaff and manure and cheap tobacco. The auctioneer's chant ran like a creek over rocks, and along the rails the buyers stood with their hats tipped, saying everything with their chins and nothing with their mouths. Cora came for the seed sale. She came with 1 bushel of navy beans in a burlap sack, cradled against her like a child, because it was the last thing she had to turn into money before winter. $1.60 of beans. She'd priced them in her head at $1.50, already shaving it, already asking less. Then they ran the windmill through. It came in on a flatbed dray, and 2 men wrestled it down onto the dirt, and the auctioneer near about apologized for it. An Aermotor 602. The steel vane was split clean up one side. The tail vane was gone entirely, so it couldn't have pointed itself into a wind if a wind had come begging. It looked like exactly what it was. A dead machine. Scrap for the Iron Man. But Cora Merrick looked at that dead machine, and her heart came up into her throat, because she did not see scrap. She saw water. She saw a tower over her cracked cistern and a wheel turning in the plains wind that never quit, and she saw the yoke hung up on a nail in the barn to gray and rot, and she saw a green crop and a stamped note, and her land, held 1 more year. Even broken, that mill was worth 30 times her bushel of beans. She knew it. Iron alone, $40 laid out on the ground there. Whole and running, near 150. She had $1.60 of beans and a debt like a stone and no more sense than to want. The bidding opened and died in about 4 seconds. Nobody wanted a busted mill in a year nobody had $1. The auctioneer looked ready to pass it on to the scrap dealer for whatever the pound would bring. And beside Cora, at her right shoulder, stood a man she'd been half aware of the whole morning. Tall, still, a stillness that wasn't ease. He held himself the way a man holds himself when noise costs him something. Dark coat too warm for the day. Hands scarred across the knuckles, burn marks old and shiny. He hadn't bid on a thing all morning. He hadn't spoken a word that she'd heard. And behind him, backed up to the rail, sat his wagon, and in the bed of the wagon rode a Sears tool chest. Oak, the lid worn, and stamped into that lid, deep 2 letters. T.R. I want you to see that chest sitting in the wagon bed. Don't make anything of it. A workman's chest, that's all, riding where a workman's chest rides. We'll be coming back for it too. We'll be coming back for it in a way that will take the wind clean out of you. The mill sat there dying in the ring. And Cora Merrick did the thing she always did and could not stop herself doing. She reached for less than she needed. She turned to the silent man. She didn't turn to the auctioneer with a bid, because a bid meant money and she had none. She turned to a stranger and she made herself as small as a person can make herself in front of a crowd, and she said it. Out loud. Clear enough that the men nearest heard. Would you take a bushel of my beans for the broken windmill? That's the question the whole thing hangs on. A bushel of beans. For a windmill. $1.60 against 40 in iron. She heard how it sounded the second it left her. She heard it land in the quiet. But she'd said it, and it was out, and she stood there with the sack against her chest and her chin up, waiting on a stranger's mercy. He looked at her. That's all. Those still gray eyes came around and looked at her, and something moved behind them. Something she couldn't read and didn't have time to, because right then, the gavel came down. It cracked like a rifle shot in that tin barn. Wood on wood, sharp as a .30-06, and it slammed off the walls. And the man beside her flinched. Not a small flinch. His whole frame dropped an inch and turned, shoulders coming up around his ears, one scarred hand half rising like it would shield his own head, a body remembering something the mind had no say over. His face went white and far away. For a half-second he was not in that sale barn at all. He was somewhere else, somewhere loud. Somewhere that took the color out of a grown man in front of 40 of his neighbors. And Cora Merrick, who could not name a fair price for her own eggs, did not stop to think about it either. She stepped sideways. She put herself between that man and the ring, between him and the auctioneer's block, her back to the noise and her body a wall, the bushel of beans still hugged to her chest. She didn't know why. She only knew he'd been struck by something, and she put herself in front of it the way you'd step in front of a child. They stood like that half a breath. Close, her shielding him from a danger that was only a sound. Nobody else even marked it. The ring had already moved on. Then he straightened. The color came back slow, and whatever door had banged open in him, he shut it, and he was still again, and he looked at her over the top of the beans she was still holding between them. He didn't take the beans. He walked forward instead, 3 steps to the block, and he reached into his coat and he laid down cash for the broken windmill. Bought it outright. $40-some, near everything a man like that would carry, laid down flat for a dead machine while a whole barn watched. And to the auctioneer, to the clerk, to the men, he said almost nothing. A word, maybe 2. Low in his chest, gravel over gravel, the voice of a man who'd forgotten the shape of his own words. The clerk had to lean in to catch it. And that should have been the strange, beautiful end of it. A quiet man buys a widow a windmill. But this is where it turned cruel, and I'll not soften it, because the cruelty is the hinge the whole story swings on. Harlan Pruitt had been watching. Pruitt was a landman. He bought drought-broke places for pennies on the ruin of people who'd given everything to hold them. He'd had his eye on Cora's 80 for a year, the rise of it, the same rise Emile had loved, and he was patient the way a buzzard's patient, and he did not care to see a widow handed even the smallest chance at water. So he made it a show. He turned to the rail, to his friends, to the whole grinning floor, and he pitched his voice to Carrie. A bushel of beans for a windmill. He let it hang. Well, about the size of her whole operation, ain't it? And the barn laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Enough that it filled the space. 40 men, and the ones who didn't laugh looked at their boots, which is its own kind of laughing. The sound rolled over Cora where she stood, the sound of the whole county deciding at once that she was a joke. A small, foolish widow who'd offered $1.60 for a $100 machine and gotten what such foolishness deserves, which was pity, which was a stranger's coins, which was this laughter. In a tin barn, in the fall, with winter coming and a note due. Her face went hot. Her eyes stung, and she would not let one drop fall in that place. She held the beans. That was the picture. Every man who tells this story later tells it the same. The widow Merrick, walking out of the Broken Bow sale barn with a bushel of navy beans still in her arms, having traded them for nothing, having been given a windmill she couldn't even haul, walking out straight back through a crowd that had just laughed her small. She got to the wagon. She set the beans in the bed. Her hands were steady by then, the hands always steadied, that was the trouble with them. And she meant to climb up and drive home and never think of it again. Chalk it to the long list of things a woman swallows. But she couldn't leave a debt sitting. That wasn't in her either. The man had laid down real money on her account, in public, and she couldn't drive off owing that. So she made herself walk back to where his wagon stood, the oak chest riding in the bed with those 2 letters cut in the lid, and she found him at the harness, and she got the words out. I can't take it as charity, mister, I don't know you. I've got the beans, they're yours, they're paid. And if that's not enough, I'll... And she heard herself starting to bargain herself down again. Offer more, offer mending, offer anything, small, smaller. I'll do your wash a month, I'll... He shook his head. Once, slow. And he said a thing. It came hard. Out of him you could see it cost him. the way a stuck bolt costs you before it turns. 3 words, ground out low, "I'll set it." That was all. "I'll set it." And Cora didn't understand, not that day, that she'd just heard this man spend more words on her than he'd spent on any living soul in a year and more. She stood there. "Set it? Where?" "On my place. I've no way to." But he'd already turned to his team. The conversation, for him, was finished, because for him it had never been a conversation. It had been a decision, made somewhere back in that barn, maybe made the second the gavel cracked, and she'd stepped in front of him without a reason in the world. Cora drove home with a bushel of beans and no idea what she'd set in motion. She lay awake that night listening to the wind she couldn't yet catch, and she burned over Pruitt's laugh, and somewhere under the burning was the memory of a man flinching at a sound, and her own body moving to shield him before her mind had a vote. She couldn't square it. She gave up trying and slept a little before the water. He came at dawn. She heard the wagon before she saw it, the particular clank and groan of a load. And she came out on the porch in the gray, with her hair still down, and there he was, turning in at her gate. The broken Aermotor lashed down in the bed, vane, tower sections, the works. The oak tool chest riding beside it. He'd loaded a dead windmill and hauled it 7 miles in the dark to a woman who'd offered him $1.60, and he climbed down and touched his hat and did not say good morning. Because good morning was 3 words he didn't have to spare. Nella Sowards came over that first afternoon, the way neighbors do, drawn by the sight of a strange man's wagon at the widow Merrick's. She stood with Cora at the edge of the yard and watched Thomas Rourke, for that was his name, she got it out of Gill. Her husband, who knew him from the Legion post, watched him pace off the ground by the cracked cistern and drive a stake and start to dig. And Nella, who had a mouth on her and a heart under it, said the thing that Cora would turn over for months. "Cora, honey," she kept her voice low. "A man does not leave his tools on a woman's porch unless he means to spend the rest of his life coming back for them." Cora laughed it off. Of course she did. "He's doing a kindness, Nella. He'll be gone by supper." He was not gone by supper. He was not gone for 9 days. He built the tower first. The legs had racked over in the years the thing had lain broke, bent out of true, and Cora watched this near-silent man take a length of pipe and a come-along, and his own weight and coax, 4 steel legs back to plumb, 1 degree at a time, sighting up the line with one eye shut like a man threading the whole sky through a needle. It took him most of a day. She brought him water. She, who knew the weight of water better than anyone alive, brought a dipper out to him, and midway through she thought to bring something better, and she carried out a jar of buttermilk cool from the cistern's one cold corner and held it up to him. He looked at it. He looked at her. And he took it, and set it on the ground by his boot, and did not drink. And went back to the come-along. She thought she'd offended him. She hadn't. She'd only run into the thing she wouldn't understand for weeks yet, that Thomas Rourke could not eat or drink in front of a person, that somewhere in France that had become impossible for him, and that a jar of buttermilk set down and left untouched was not a rejection, but a wall he did not yet know how to come out from behind. The next days he built her the vane. He had no whole steel one and no money to buy, so he made it. He set a forge up right there in her yard out of a wash tub and a hand crank blower off his wagon, and he heated iron and beat it flat and cut it and shaped a new tail to catch the wind and turn the wheel into it. And on the second day of that, standing at the fire, he did a thing without planning it. He held a piece to the coals, and he needed the air up, and instead of stepping to crank the blower himself, he looked at Cora, and he lifted his chin at the crank, and she came and put her hands to it and pumped, and the coals went from red to orange to a white that hurt to look at, and the 2 of them stood there in the heat, working one fire between them. It was the first task they ever shared. Her hands on the blower, his on the iron. And in the roar of it he said a word. She thought it was there, just there, when the heat came up right, and it was the nearest thing to a conversation she'd had with him, and it went straight through her and she didn't know why. He rebabbited the gears up in the head of the mill, poured molten metal to make new bearings for the old worn shaft. And for that he needed a steady pour, and again he looked at her. And she climbed the tower behind him and steadied the ladle while he poured, the two of them 30 feet up in the wind with hot metal between them and not 10 words spoken in an hour. And all the while, the small things. He set her pump handle lower. Just took it off and rehung it a hand's width down. So a woman of her height wouldn't have to reach and haul against her own shoulders, a thing Emile had never thought of in 10 years, and this man saw in one afternoon. She found it changed one morning and stood there working it, easy now. And something in her chest pulled tight. The loose porch step, the one she'd stepped over for 2 years, she came out one dawn and it was mended. Squared and nailed and solid, and she'd never asked and he'd never mentioned, and there was no way to thank a man who wouldn't hold still to be thanked. She watched him. She couldn't help it. She saw that he wouldn't eat until she'd gone in the house or turned to some chore she'd catch, from the window, the quick private way he'd take a bite of bread only when he thought himself unwatched. Like eating was a shameful thing, or a dangerous one. She started leaving his dinner on the mended step and going inside, so he could have it in peace, and she'd watch the plate empty from behind the curtain and her throat would ache, and she couldn't have told you what for. The jar of buttermilk sat on the ground by the tower those 9 days. She refilled it. He never drank it. And she stopped expecting him to. 9 days. A stranger on a widow's place, straightening steel and forging iron and pouring bearings and mending steps, answering a bushel of beans with the whole of himself, and saying, in all that time, fewer words than you've heard in this last minute. And Cora Merrick, who had trained herself for 2 years to want nothing out loud, felt something she had no name for and no defense against, standing in her own yard watching a silent man build her a way to stop carrying water. On the 9th day it was near done. The tower stood plumb and painted with what he'd had. The new vane hung true. The gears turned free when he spun them by hand up top, and the sucker rod ran clean down into the well he'd deepened. All it wanted was the wind, and the pin pulled and the wheel let loose to turn. And on the 9th day, at noon, Cora carried the buttermilk out one more time, not expecting a thing, just habit now, just kindness, set down and left. Thomas Rourke came down off the tower. He crossed the yard to her. He stopped close, closer than the work had ever put them, and he looked at the jar in her hands. And then he looked at her face, and slow, so slow, watching her the whole while like a man stepping onto ice he wasn't sure would hold, he took the jar. And he drank. Right there. In front of her. His eyes on hers over the rim, the thing he could not do in front of any living soul. And he did it in front of Cora Merrick in the noon light of the 9th day. And when he lowered the jar there was buttermilk on his lip, and his hand was not quite steady, and Cora understood, not the whole of it, not yet, but enough, that she had just been shown something. That a wall had come down. That whatever this man could not do, he had just done, for her on purpose, and that it meant more than any speech a whispering barn could ever have laughed at. She opened her mouth. To say what, she never knew. Thank you. Stay. Something too big for the yard. And the wind came up out of the west, the way it always did at noon on that rise, the wind Emile had loved. And it caught the new vane. And 30 feet over their heads the wheel, for the first time in who knows how many broken years, shuddered and groaned, and began, slowly and then all at once, to turn. The wheel turned, and the wheel pumped, and down in the dark of the well the sucker rod rose and fell like a thing breathing. Cora heard the water before she saw it. A knock in the pipe. A cough of air. And then it came. Out of the spout and into the trough, first a spit, then a stream, then a good steady run that did not stop. She stood and watched it. Water she had not carried. Water no yoke had crossed her shoulders to bring. It filled the trough and ran over the lip and darkened the dust, and still it came, because up above them the wind kept on, and the wheel kept on. And the whole thing worked the way Emile had once promised her it would. 1,100 gallons a day. That was what a mill like that gave, running fair. 1,100 gallons for a woman who had carried every drop by hand for 2 years. She put her fingers in the stream. It was cold, and it was clean, and it was hers. When she looked up, Thomas Rourke was watching the water too, not her. The water. And something in his face had eased that she had not seen ease in 9 days. She still had the beans. That was the thing she could not get past. The bushel of navy beans sat in her wagon bed where it had sat since the sale barn. $1.60 of beans, and it was all she had offered and all she had. And this man had given her a windmill and 9 days of his hands and had taken nothing. Not the beans. Not a meal she could make him eat easy. Not $1, because she had tried, on the 4th day, to press what little she had into his palm, and he had closed her fingers back over it and turned away. "Take the beans," she said now. "Please, take something." He looked at the sack. Then he looked at her. And he shook his head, once, slow, and there was no unkindness in it, but there was no give in it either. The sun went down that evening the way it does in September, fast at the end, the light going out of the west all at once. Thomas gathered his hand tools. He wiped each one on a rag, and Cora watched him do it. He climbed onto his wagon. He lifted the reins. And he left the toolbox on her porch, the big one. The Sears oak chest with TR stamped into the lid. He did not carry it to the wagon. He did not so much as look back at it. He clucked to his horse and rolled out of her yard in the last of the light, and the chest sat there on her porch boards, square and heavy and full of every tool a man like that owned. Cora stood in the yard a long while. She did not understand it. A man does not leave his tools. She knew that much. Her father had been a wheelwright, and she knew what a man's tools were to him. They were his hands, only better. They were years of picking the right one and paying too much for it, and wearing the handle smooth. A man will leave his coat. A man will leave his dinner. A man does not leave his tools on a woman's porch and drive off into the dark. Nella said it plainer when she came by 2 days after. Nella Soward stood on that porch and looked at the chest and looked at Cora, and she said, "A man does not leave his tools on a woman's porch unless he means to spend the rest of his life coming back for them." Cora didn't answer that. She couldn't. It sat too close to something she wanted and would not let herself want. Because here is the trouble Cora Merrick carried, and had carried longer than the debt. She could not take a thing. She could offer. She could give. She could work herself gray and never say it was too much. But to take, to be given to, and simply keep it, that felt to her like theft. Like standing at the sale barn with a bushel of beans and asking for a windmill. Small, a shamed wanting more than she had a right to. So the toolbox on her porch was not a gift to her. It was a debt, one more thing she owed. And Cora Merrick paid her debts. She decided to give it back. At dawn she loaded the chest into her cart. It took everything she had to lift it, and she braced it and heaved it and skinned her knuckles on the tailboard, and she did not care. She would drive it to wherever Thomas Rourke stayed and set it down and be square with him. She found his place. It wasn't hard. Gil had said he rented a shed and a lean-to off the Kimball Road, 7 miles east, and worked what smithing came. She drove the 7 miles with the chest rattling behind her and her whole speech ready in her mouth. And when she got there, she could not knock. She sat in the cart in his yard and looked at his door, and her nerve went out of her like water out of a cracked jar. What would she say? "Here, take your tools back. I don't want to owe you." And him standing there, mute, looking at her with those eyes, hearing her say she wanted nothing of his. She could not do it. So she set the chest down by his shed, in the wet grass, and she left. Left without a word. Drove the 7 miles home with the cart empty and light and her heart heavier than the chest had ever been. 2 mornings later the chest was back on her porch. He'd brought it in the night. She had not heard a wagon. But there it sat, oak and iron and TR, In the lid, home again, as if it belonged to her porch and had only been away. She tried once more. She sent it back with Gil, asked him plain to carry it to Rourke and make him keep it. Gil did. Gil told her later that Thomas had listened to the whole of it, standing in his shed with the forge cold, and then had loaded the chest onto his own wagon and driven it right back to Cora's and set it down and driven off, all without a word. And that Gil had never in his life felt so useless as a man carrying a message between two people who would not say the thing. The third time she tried to hand it to him herself. She saw him outside the store in Broken Bow, loading a keg of nails, and she went to him with her chin up and said, "Mr. Rourke, I can't keep your tools," and she reached to take his hand and put the matter in it. He stepped back. He set the keg in his wagon. He touched his hat brim to her, the smallest courtesy, and he walked away down the boardwalk, and she stood there in the street with her hand out and nothing in it and 40 years of her pride gone hot in her face. That was the day Gil told her the truth. He caught her at the wagon. He was a Legion man, Gil, and Thomas was his one friend from the post, the two of them sitting silent together some evenings, which suited them both. Gil had held his peace a long time. But he'd watched Cora try 3 times to give back a heart in an oak box, and he couldn't stand it anymore. "Cora," he said, "you need to know a thing about Tom Rourke." And he told her, Meuse-Argonne, the fall of 18. Gil said the words like they cost him. A shell had come in close enough to kill the 2 men beside Thomas and leave Thomas standing, and something in the standing had broken worse than any wound. He'd come home 3 years back, and in 3 years he had not strung 10 words together at one time. Not to his own mother, before she passed, not to Gil. The war had taken his speech and had not given it back. "That windmill," Gil said. "That's the first thing I've seen him finish since France. 9 days he worked at your place. That mill turning, Cora, that's the first sentence that man has said in 3 years. And he said it to you." Cora stood very still. The buttermilk. Day 9. Him watching her over the rim of the jar, doing the thing he could not do in front of any living soul. She had known it was something. She had not known it was everything. He could not tell her. That was the whole of it. He could not say a word to her, not one, and so he had straightened a tower and forged a vane and set a platform over her well and made water come up out of the ground for her. He could not say it, so he had built it. And when he was done, he had left her the only sentence he had left to give. His tools, his hands, his trade. Everything a man like that was, set down on her porch because he could not set down the words. And she had tried 3 times to give it back. She drove home slow. The reframing of a thing is a strange labor. You look at 9 days and you see them one way, and then a man says 4 sentences to you outside a store, and the same 9 days turn over in your hands and show you their other face. And you cannot believe you did not see it. Every jar of buttermilk. The pump handle he'd hung lower, for her reach, without a word. The porch step he'd mended that she had not asked him to mend. The way he would not eat until she looked away, sparing her the sight of a thing he was ashamed he could not do. And then, on the 9th day, choosing not to be spared. Choosing to be seen. He had been courting her the only way the war had left him able. And she, God help her, had kept trying to pay him back. Pruitt came the next week. Harlan Pruitt drove into her yard in his good buggy and looked up at the mill turning and did not like what he saw. Cora watched him do the arithmetic. "No water," he'd said, at the barn, before 40 men. No water, no crop, no reason to keep the place. And here was water, 1,100 gallons of it a day, running into a full trough, and green coming up in the near field where she'd got a late planting in. He made his offer smooth. Said he'd take the 80 acres off her hands, save her the worry of the note, a fair price considering. He named a figure that was an insult with its hat off. Cora let him finish. Then she said, "I've got water now, Mr. Pruitt, and I've got a crop in the ground. And the note's mine to carry, not yours. He didn't laugh this time. There were no 40 men to laugh with him. He looked at her a moment and looked at the mill and got back in his buggy, and Cora watched him go with a straightness in her spine she had not owned in 2 years. She began to use the tools. She had no choice. Some of it. A hinge went, and the pump wanted a packing, and there was no one but her. So she opened the great oak chest and took out what she needed. And here is the thing she started to do, and could not have told you why at first. When she was done with a tool, she did not put it back where it belonged. She put it back wrong. The 3/8 wrench went in the tray for the files. The tap wrenches went where the pliers lived. She shuffled his neat trays into a small, quiet chaos, tool by tool, and she told herself it was carelessness. It was not carelessness. Some part of her, ahead of the rest, knew that a man who came back to fetch his tools would have to open the chest and find them out of place and reach in and set them right. That she was building a reason for him to come. She was leaving loose ends for those good hands to tie. She found the dance card cleaning the tap wrenches. They lived under the bottom tray, the tap wrenches, and to get at them you lifted the tray out whole, and when Cora lifted it that afternoon, a card slid out from underneath and fell to the floor of the chest. Stiff paper, gone soft at the corners, printed at the top, faded but plain, Grange Social, and under it a year. 1913. A dance card. The little pencil still tied on with a bit of string. She knew what it was before she turned it over. Her hands knew. She had filled out 100 of them as a girl, Cora Voss, the best dancer in the county, some said, before a meal, before the 80 acres, before the yoke and the debt and the widowhood. A dance card, with the dances numbered down the side and a line by each for the man who'd claimed it. She turned it over. And there, in a careful hand pressed into the paper 8 years before, was written a name. Not his. Hers, Cora Voss. Written by a young man in 1913, so he would not lose the space. So no one else would take the dance he meant to have. She sat down on the floor of her own kitchen with the card in her 2 hands, and she could not get her breath. 8 years. He had kept it 8 years. He had carried it to France. He had carried it through the shell that took his voice and the 2 men beside him, and he had carried it home, and he had kept it under the bottom tray of his toolbox all this time. He had not met her at the sale barn. That was the piece that came last and hardest. He had not happened to be standing beside her at the ring when the broken Aermotor ran through. Cora Voss. He had known her name before she ever said the title question. He had stood beside her on purpose. A man like that, who could not walk into a room easy, who could not eat before a stranger, that man had arranged, somehow, for weeks, to be at that sale barn, in that spot, beside that widow. On that day. Gil would tell her later he'd been asking after the Merrick place since July. 2 months. 2 months of a silent man working out how to stand next to her without frightening her off. And then the beans. And the question. And everything after. The whole toolbox was the confession, and the card under the tray was the sentence at the bottom of it. He had loved Cora Voss since 1913, and he had never once been able to say so, and he had built her a windmill instead. That was the hour the rest of it came down. Gil rode over that same evening, and she knew from his face. Thomas had taken a smithing job out west. A good job, steady, at a rail town 2 days' travel. He was leaving on the next train. Tuesday, and the reason he gave Gil, the only reason, was that Mrs. Merrick kept sending his tools back. 3 times now, and a man could take a hint. She wanted nothing of him. Better to go where his hands were wanted plain, for wages, with no widow to trouble. He was leaving with his dignity and his whole heart misread, and it was her doing. And Tuesday, the same day, 2 letters came from town. One was Elgin at the trust. The note, $312, due the 1st of April, the bank wanted it early. Some tightening, some policy, the words did not matter. They wanted it now. Or they wanted the land. The other was Pruitt. His final offer, lower than the first, with a deadline stamped at the bottom. Timed like a man who has read the bank's mind because he has bought the bank's ear. water and a crop and a card with her name in it, and she stood to lose all three by Tuesday. Most women would have driven to the depot, would have run down the platform with a speech ready, the way it goes in the pictures. Cora thought about it. She stood in her kitchen with the dance card on the table and the two cruel letters beside it, and she thought about a speech. And then she thought, he does not speak. Why would I answer him with a speech? She answered him the way he had asked her, with work, with a thing his hands could not walk away from. She took the 3/8 wrench, the one thing on that whole mill that fit the main nut on the pump gear, and she put it in her apron pocket. And then she loosened that nut. Not much. Just enough that by morning the mill would sing wrong, a knock in it, a nut working itself loose the way a nut does. And she sent Gil to Thomas with a message, and she made Gil swear to say it plain. Tell him the mill's come loose. Tell him the pump nut's stripping and the right wrench has gone missing out of the chest, and there's not another that fits it in the county, and the crop's on that water and the note's on that crop. Tell him a job's come undone that only his hands can set right, and it can't wait for the next man, and it can't wait for the next train. Gil looked at her a long moment. Then something like a smile went across his face, the first she'd seen on him in weeks. You want me to tell Tom Rourke, he said, that there's a broken thing at your place only he can fix. Yes, Cora said. Tell him that. He came Monday, the day before the train. She heard the wagon at first light, and she stood at her window and watched him drive into the yard. And her heart was going like the pump rod. He climbed down. He went to the chest on her porch, his chest, TR in the lid, and he opened it. And she watched him find his trays all wrong, every tool in the neighbor's place, and she watched him take that in. He was not a fool. He looked at the chest a long time. Then he went to the mill and he found the loose nut. And he reached for the 3/8 wrench that was not there, because it was in her apron pocket and had been for a week. Cora came out onto the porch. He straightened at the well and looked at her across the yard, 40 steps of packed dirt, the mill turning slow above them with its little knock in it. He did not speak. He would not. But he was here, and he had not gone west, and his tools were in her chest, and his card was in her kitchen, and his name was stamped in the lid, and hers was under the bottom tray in his own hand from 1913. She did not run down the steps. She stood where she was, and she said the only thing that needed saying. I wasn't giving them back, she said. I never wanted to give them back. I was only afraid to keep them. He came across the yard. She got the crop in on his water. The whole county could see it, the green field turning to a stand, and the stand turning to money. The beans she might have traded away now rooted in her own 80 acres, her own ground, paying her at last. In March she cut and hauled and sold, and she carried the sum of it to town in a folded envelope inside her coat, over her heart. The bank was quiet that morning, front glass letting in a thin spring light, dust in it, the smell of ink and old paper. Elgin at his counter. He took her envelope and he counted it, slow, licking his thumb. And it was all there. $312, and the note not yet due, the 1st of April still a week off. He drew out the note. He wetted the stamp on its little pad. And he brought it down on the paper, paid, and the sound of it was soft. Nothing at all. A clerk's small stamp on a widow's small debt. Cora folded the paid note into her apron, and she felt something go out of her shoulders that had been there so long she'd stopped feeling the weight of it. Through the front glass, out on the walk, Harlan Pruitt stood watching. He'd come for the land. He'd read the bank's mind and made his deadline and been so sure no water, no crop, no reason to keep the place, 40 men to hear him say it. He watched through the glass as the note was stamped paid, and he said nothing. There was nothing left for him to say. After a moment he turned and went on down the walk, a landman with no land to take. And Cora watched him go, and did not even feel the pleasure she'd thought she would. She just felt light. The Spring Grange dance was the first Saturday in April. The same hall, the same fiddles tuning up in the corner. And along the wall, the same men who'd stood at the sale barn ring in September and laughed at a bushel of beans. Cora came in her good dress. Cora Voss, some of the older ones remembered, the best dancer in the county the year before the war, back before Emile, back before all of it. Thomas Rourke stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands. He had not gone west. He would not be going west. But a dance is a room full of people, and a room full of people was the hardest thing in the world for a man like him. And he stood in the doorway and made himself walk through it, for her, the way he'd made himself drink the buttermilk. Nella saw him first and stopped talking mid-word. The room quieted, the way a room quiets. The way that barn had quieted the day of the beans, only this was the other side of the coin. And every soul in the hall felt it turn over. Pruitt was near the door. And Cora, passing him, gave him the only words she ever spent on him again. Dry, even, final. Turns out, she said, it kept the place. And she walked past him to the man in the doorway, and she took Thomas Rourke by his rough hand, and she led him out onto the floor, and the fiddles found the tune. And the best dancer in Custer County danced with a man who could not say a word, and did not need to. April, on the 80 acres. The mill turning behind the house, steady, sound, the little knock long since gone out of it. He crossed the yard to her one morning where she stood by the well. He wanted a wrench. 3/8. He held up his hand and made the small shape of the thing, because that was how they talked, and would go on talking, in shapes and looks and work, and it was enough. It was more than enough. She had it in her apron pocket. She'd had it there for weeks. She took it out and put it in his palm. He turned it over, and he made another shape, a question. Where were the rest of them? The chest was full of tools, all in the wrong trays still, because she had never set them right. Because a woman who sets the tools right is a woman with no reason to be come back to.
She told him wrong, on purpose. Pointed him to the file tray for the pliers, the plier slot for the taps, sent his good hands hunting through his own chest for things that weren't where she said. He looked at her. He knew. Of course he knew, and the corner of his mouth went up, and he shook his head, slow, and he set to hunting anyway because he understood the game and he meant to lose it every day for the rest of his life. He'd be back tomorrow. There was always a nut come loose, a hinge gone, a wrench gone missing. She'd see to that. The toolbox stayed on the shelf by the door, oak and iron, TR stamped in the lid and tucked back under the bottom tray where it had ridden to France and home again. The dance card, with Cora Voss penciled in a young man's careful hand, kept hidden 8 years and never once needing to be hidden again. Think of the two women. The one who stood at a sale barn with a bushel of beans in her arms, ashamed, asking for the smallest thing she could name, sure it was already too much. And the one who was left a man's whole trade on her porch and finally learned to keep it. Same woman, same 80 acres. The beans she'd have traded away for a broken windmill are in her own ground now, feeding her. She asked for the smallest thing she could name. And he answered her with everything he had, and then he left the one tool that made sure he'd have to keep coming back for it, love built, in the end, with 2 pairs of hands. If someone once answered your small question with their whole self, tell me about it in the comments. And tell me the town you're watching from. I'd like to know how far this one traveled.